Hello to everyone and Slava Ukraini, Героям Slava. That's our meeting that we call Breakfast Background on Ukraine, which we decided to organize to help journalists in the world and also those who are working in Ukraine now to understand Ukraine more deeply, to explain Ukraine, to explain Russia, and to explain Ukrainian-Russian relations in this war context. Today we invited two really great and fantastic prominent speakers who really may bring a lot of value to this conversation. Mr. Plokhy, Serhii Plokhy, who is a historian. He knows everything about our past and important lessons the world could learn from it. While Sviatoslav Vakarchuk, a rock star and a former MP, knows everything about the soul of Ukraine and our spirit. That's what is our conversation today about. I will introduce Mr. Serhii Plokhy. He's a Ukrainian and American historian, currently Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, and award-winning author of many books, including the one, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine. So the book that explains Ukraine very precisely, and the book we recommend everyone to read. Both speakers today have traveled a lot, and they used to travel a lot before the war, and Sviatoslav has studied and had research fellowships in the West, in the US. Professor Plokhy works at Harvard University. Let's start with Professor Plokhy. What is your impression today of what has the world found out new about Ukraine after 2004, then after 2014, and what do you feel the world now knows more from Ukraine's history after this invasion in 2022?
Well, first of all, thank you for this invitation. It is a pleasure to be part of this discussion, especially with Slavko Vakarchuk. It's really a pleasure and honor. Ukraine really entered the Western media space in 2004 with the Maidan protests and the Orange Revolution. And entered in a very positive way. Few people knew about Ukraine before that. If people heard anything about Ukraine, very often that was connected to very dramatic and tragic events dealing with World War II, Holocaust. And in 2004, Ukraine revealed itself as a young nation that was prepared to stand up for democracy. Against elections that the authorities were trying to steal from Ukrainian people. Those were peaceful protests, very colorful ones. I remember in DC, people were asking half jokingly a question of what is wrong with you Ukrainians? You can't have a revolution that wouldn't look like a street party. So that was the beginning of really Ukraine's introduction into the international media, international sphere, as far as general public was concerned. And then, of course, came 2014, which was less colorful, but really was reinforcing the same message that Ukraine was about freedom, Ukraine was about democracy. Then as the war started in 2014 and this latest escalation, dramatic escalation, tragic escalation came in February of this year, Ukraine revealed itself also in a different way. There was nothing that really Washington and Moscow could agree before the start of the invasion. The tensions were quite high, extremely high, except on one thing, and that's that in Washington or in Moscow, no one counted on Ukraine resisting for more than a couple of days. And Ukraine surprised everyone. I have been on a number of panels in the last weeks dealing with Ukraine, dealing with where different aspects of the war were discussed, including the military. And the world ended up to have no really anyone who could predict the resistance of the Ukrainian army, the resistance, the resilience of Ukrainian people. It came as a major surprise, and of course, very, very positive surprise. What I think is that we are now living through a really historic moment of formation of a new Ukrainian nation, the nation that it's not just conscious of its own identity, but now with this latest development sent a very clear message to the rest of the world, and Russia in particular, that Ukraine does exist, that it is not a failed state. This is the state that functions under the bombs, maybe even better than it functioned before. This is not a nation that doesn't exist or has no historic or other right to exist, as has been claimed by Putin in his publications and his pronouncements. And this war really changes the world. And despite the tragedy, despite the numerous victims, and I'm afraid we are not over yet, I'm optimistic in the long term about Ukraine, and because of what Ukraine does, also more optimistic about the world than I was a few months earlier.
So you are more optimistic. That's great. But what do you think about what does the world still doesn't understand? Is there anything the world still doesn't understand from your perspective regarding Ukrainian question for Russia? Having into consideration our history of like 5 centuries and different relations to Russia, or mainly from Russia to Ukraine.
Well, the world and Europe in particular, I'm currently in Europe, is really surprised by Ukrainian resistance, because if we are dealing with the army that the entire Europe and the world are afraid of, if you look at the last 100 years, that army would roll into Czechoslovakia, at the start of World War II, take over the Baltic states without much resistance. And even today, the voices have been there. Okay, you live next to this powerful and aggressive neighbor. Isn't it better for you to reach some kind of a modus vivendi and not doing that? So that's an example of really commitment to the idea of state, of nation, that the world didn't expect and now learning about Ukraine. In terms of relations between Russia and Ukraine, if there were people before who were prepared to buy into the Russian narrative about Ukraine not being a real country, about Ukraine being run by Nazis or nationalists, this narrative had been decisively defeated on the battlegrounds of Ukraine. And in that sense, there is much better understanding that, first of all, the Russian narrative is false, and that you deal with a real nation committed to democracy, committed to European values, and that is the mood of the day, of the hour. That's the way how I at least read the reporting in the media. That's how I read what I see on TV this day, and what I hear from my friends and colleagues.
Can you say, as a historian, more on Ukrainian nationalism, what it is? Because looks like what we hear from different journalists from around the world, especially from Europe, they come here and some of them, not many of them, but some of them are trying to find some Nazis here. Can you say what means Ukrainian nationalism and why is Europe so, let's say, afraid or worried about it? Is it because of the experience of Germany and Italy before?
Well, Ukrainian nationalism went through the same stages as European nationalism, Central and East Central European nationalism, went through from the romantic nationalists of the 19th century with the collection of the folklore about glorious historical past of the nations to the political stage, to the rise of radical nationalism during the interwar period and during the Second World War. So in that sense, Ukrainian nationalism is very, very normal. What is abnormal about Ukrainian nationalism is that Ukraine, despite the fact that we are in the state of the war, the nationalist parties are not represented in the parliament. And this is abnormal. You look at the European, Central European countries, the nationalist parties of France for that matter, nationalist parties are really very influential, very important, or at least the ideas and themes associated with nationalism are important. And this is the reason why a lot in Europe are really concerned about nationalism in general and are prepared to see it anywhere and everywhere. My question to the people who talk about Ukrainian nationalism and to people who look for it is just to think about two things and try to explain to yourself, to your readers, and to myself, because I don't have a clear answer to those questions as well. The first issue would be about the only president of the Jewish background anywhere in the world outside of Israel and being extremely popular in Ukraine and elected with 73% of the vote. There were two prime ministers before that who were of Jewish background. One of them also was the head of the parliament of Verkhovna Rada. So this is extremely unique. So please think about that and try to understand what is behind that. And one thing is that behind that is really a very strong sense of civic identity in Ukraine. So please focus on that. And the second question is the question that I asked, why the nationalists are not in the parliament, why they can't cross the 5% threshold. And again, my guess is the answer is the same as the answer to the first question. It's about a strength of civic identity. Look at the footage that comes from Melitopol, that comes from Kherson, from the Ukrainian cities, Russian-speaking cities, in southern Ukraine, with people marching under Ukrainian banners against tanks. That's what Ukraine is about. So you have questions about nationalism, try to answer those that I posed in front of you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Plokhy. And now I would like to get back to Sviatoslav Vakarchuk, who feels very well the soul of Ukraine and our spirit. And you also know, I think, almost everything about the civic identity regarding your experience and also your endless meetings with lots of people, with lots of youth, volunteers, diplomats. What is your perception, reflection on what's happening, on how the world is perceiving Ukraine now, and on this civic identity of Ukraine?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here. Great honor to be here on the panel with Professor Plokhy, who is one of my favorite writers on history. This is not an easy question because we can talk about identities a lot. Francis Fukuyama wrote a great book on identity, and it's very difficult also even to determine somehow a notion of identity. But what is clear for me, and I keep repeating it all the time, that today Ukraine is being born as a political nation. So we had a long history of being an ethnical nation, 500 years or more. I think Professor Plokhy knows better, but we were struggling to build a political nation because of different reasons. Most of them because the empire we were part of was completely trying to ruin all our efforts. And generally, we understand that Russian elite, and to the great extent, the Russian society does not recognize and does not take seriously the very existence of Ukrainian state. So, in this particular case, in this paradigm, Ukraine reminds me of Ukrainian struggle for independence and for identity. Reminds me of what Israel was facing for a long time when it was surrounded by hostile neighbors who didn't recognize, and some of them still don't recognize the existence of the state. So the only actually we were trying to build this political nation with peaceful methods, but the biggest impact, or probably the biggest boost that was given to this effort was done absolutely unexpectedly for the creator of this I would say crime, but it was Putin who actually started this war. And in weeks, or probably in a matter of days, Ukrainians very quickly identified the most important thing for them, and this is freedom, and this is dignity. And we were talking about that during Maidans, both of them. But let's be honest. There was only big part of Ukrainians who felt that, but there was another part of Ukrainians who was, sometimes puzzled during both Maidans in 2004 and 2013 and 14. And even the annexation of Crimea and war in Donbass left some of our country mates, let's say, puzzled and still not sure about what is to be Ukrainian. And this war, which started right now, made it very clear. So we are fighting for our future and our freedom. And maybe there are other Eastern Slavic people who are our neighbors, but only for Ukrainians, the value of freedom and the value of dignity is superior, is supreme. And this is something that our people are ready to fight for, are ready to give their lives for. And this is probably the most, the strongest expression of your value, if you're ready to die for the value. And I want to follow up on what Professor Plokhy said about perception in the West. Many nations, and most nations who are now, let's say, democratic, liberal, prosperous nations, went through this path. The problem is that most of them went through this path very, very long time ago. And if we talk about, for example, the United States, so what we are trying to achieve now is exactly what the United States were trying to achieve and achieved successfully during the war for independence. So we are fighting not for the right to, to eat or to breathe. We're fighting for the right to be who we want to be, and for the right only to define our future by ourselves, and for our values, which are these values of freedom. Think about the very interesting fact that Ukrainians, contrary to Russians, for example, with whom Russians claim we have so many similarities, it's absolutely unheard or unacceptable for Ukrainians to bear the power of those who do some harm for Ukraine. So the moment the president or the party in Ukraine works against the interest of people, and people feel it, it's very important that people feel it, they either say the word in the elections and the power is completely different, or like in 2013 or 14, they fight up till the end before forcing the power or the authorities to give up. And we know this example that the president or former president of the 2013 or 14 events, Yanukovych, he just fled away. And
And this is in our soul, and this is in our DNA. So we are not ready to give up something that we feel we own. And the Rubicon was crossed on the 24th of February 2022, when Ukrainians finally understood that there is no other way to defend ourselves than to fight and to give up your lives and your health and everything on the front line. So in my opinion, the message to the West should be, Ukraine now is doing what you were doing many years ago, each of you. But moreover, Ukraine is now defending the values you created and you were fighting for 100 years ago or 200 years ago or somebody 50 years ago. And if Putin in the worst case scenario prevails, it will be only the beginning of a nightmare for the democratic world. It will be not the end, it will be the beginning. And that's why we always say, we don't want your troops on the ground now. We are fighting for our lands, for our land and our children's future. But what we need your help, because the quicker we win this war, the quicker the whole world will calm down and will once again be, once again we'll live peaceful time. And the more Western powers hesitate to help, the longer the problems and this anxiety in the world is going to exist. So it's the opposite of, in my opinion, I feel that the opposite of the opposite to the fears of Western politicians is true. It's not that they helping us, they provoke Putin and they start the World War III or something. It's vice versa. By helping us, they make sure that this nightmare stops as soon as possible, because then we will be able to fight the enemy. So I think it's first time for 300 years since probably Bogdan Khmelnytsky times, we have a real, real chance to establish a political identity of Ukraine and a very strong and robust statehood of Ukraine. And we certainly won't squander it, and we will fight till the end to make sure that this time we succeed.
What do you think, what you said that we need more support from the West, why do you think the West is kind of sometimes hesitating? Why are they doing this? We had recently, just on Monday, we had a conversation here with Roman Ketcher, professor of psychology and psychiatry, psychoanalyst, who wrote two great pieces about Putin's mentality, Putin's psycho, and he said that that the West doesn't understand and is doing wrong. What do you think?
It's very difficult for me to be in the heads of top politicians in the West. I wouldn't be that naive to think that they don't understand what Putin does. They are smart people, and the problem is their calculus. So sometimes calculus in these kind of big events like Caribbean crisis or even today's crisis and the Russian-Ukrainian war, there are many factors, and many governments of different nations have their own interests and have their own calculus, and it's very entangled, and sometimes it's very difficult to find the one reason. But what we need to understand, that this is a repetition of what was going on in the 30s in Europe, when Europe was, and the world was watching actually and contemplating the rise of Hitler and Third Reich, and there were many calculus and many governments they just decided not to interfere too much in order to appease Hitler. And at the end, we know, I don't need to repeat once again all these things about Munich and afterwards. And so Putin acts exactly the same way. He acts as a strong person who wants to to everybody to get scared everybody, and afterwards he crosses the red line, and if nobody is resisting, he crosses the next red line and the next red line and the next. So I think soon, little by little, Western governments understand that the only way to stop Putin is to resist. And we are seeing, and we need to admit it, that the scope and magnitude of help this time to Ukraine is much higher than it used to be. And there are some very, very decisive steps from our partners that really helps us, especially in military equipment and economic aid and sanctions against Russia. But as it sometimes happens, the more we resist, the more means we need and the more help we need. And the darkest night is always before dawn, and we are still at the point when the battle is not decided and the impact of battle is not decided. So I'm sure that in long run, and I agree here with Professor Plokhy, that we will win. And Ukraine already has won spiritually and strategically. But the question is, by what price? And this is the most important question for us now, because we still have a long time to go. There will be, unfortunately, and we need to be very clear, there will be much more crimes and atrocities that Russian army and Russian government is committing in Ukraine, because they still has a big power in the air. They still have a lot of troops. They still have a lot of tanks and everything, and it will be difficult for Ukraine in upcoming months. We need to be very clear. But the problem, but the question is that Ukraine will win, but by what mean, and what will be the cost for the West as well? So my message is very simple. The bigger help you give us now, the less problems you and the world will have later. So it's very, very simple. And this may be, let's say, too black and white situation, but that's what I'm sure we are talking about. It's black and white. Either you help Ukraine to win the war, and then you are on the white side of light, on the light side of life, and you're fighting for freedom and help fighting for freedom, or you abstain, and then it means that indirectly you help Putin if you abstain. You're just watching because, and Dante said that those who are impartial are the biggest sinners. So this is it.
Yep. And my last question, short question before we get to question of others here. We often hear from people all over the world when they remind of revolution of dignity, and you spoke a lot about freedom and dignity as main values. We often forget about it, but in the West especially. But why? What is your perception? Why do we call it a revolution of dignity?
Because Ukrainians never accept that somebody wants to be higher or better than them. We also don't want to be higher or better than somebody else. For me, dignity is if you treat somebody not higher and not lower than you are. It's very, very simple. And Ukrainians always were like that. We have already mentioned that people of different origin, national origin, are politicians in Ukraine. We have Jewish, Armenian, Polish, other people who just are. We elect them. We feel all of us as Ukrainians. So this nation, Ukrainian nation, never wanted to prevail, but we never want to also be prevailed by somebody else and to be subdued by somebody else. So this dignity is in our veins. Russians couldn't stop us being Ukrainians during the nightmare times of Tsarism, when they were prohibiting speaking Ukrainian publicly or doing science or arts in Ukraine. They didn't stop us being already a Soviet country they didn't stop us from being individual and free, even during Holodomor, when they actually deliberately destroyed 6 million or more of Ukrainian peasants just because they wanted to be independent and they opposed communism. So they didn't help. It didn't help. And moreover, even during so-called, let's say, stable Soviet times, Ukrainians always were, let's say, playing very important role for the Soviet Union, which actually Russia then kind of stealed this kind of ownership of these positive things. You know that the big bulk, or probably the majority of Ukrainians, of Soviet sergeants, were Ukrainians. And sergeant is a very important rank in an army. So it's not an officer, but it's somebody who is next to your soldiers, to your privates, and who is actually responsible for functioning of the army on the ground. And they were chosen Ukrainians because you see now why. Now you see why. Because Ukrainians are the best fighters. And I'm proud that we are now the bravest nation in the world, and our nation is the best fighters. So many Western people, they certainly couldn't separate Ukrainians from Russian during the Soviet times, and they sometimes equalized the Soviet, kind of successes, Soviet victories with just Russian victories. But we need to understand that even during World War II, a very, very big part of victory was done by Ukrainian soldiers. And this is the first time in many, many centuries that Ukrainian army, except of those who were fighting for Austro-Hungary against Russia in World War I, but it's the first time that Ukrainians are fighting not next to Russians with somebody in the army, but fighting against Russians. And you see the result. And Russia cannot win just because Ukrainians are not with them, but against them. And they will not win, certainly.
I think that's what we saw in the... I remember when we went with Joe to the film Serhii Plokhy with your soundtrack,
yeah.
and that shows, and I recommend everyone who still didn't see the film in the West to see it and understand Ukraine better, and we can get to the questions. Joe.
Great. Is this clear? Well, as an American, I've been in Ukraine for 2 years. Oh, sorry. There we go. I've been in Ukraine for 2 years, and I have an understanding of this. I think it's the freest country I've ever visited in all of my travels, and I've really felt that these past 2 years. But Professor, you say, I think you're more optimistic than I am about what Americans think about Ukraine. I think even in Congress, there's a lot of confusion about what this country is, and really, there's not a deep sense of like the sort of the philosophy you have of this nation of every single Ukrainian I know has this Maidan mentality in their heart, but the West does not know what that is. And I think, so I want to know here, Professor, if you think, is it right to be optimistic about what Americans think about Ukraine? I mean, certainly I hear a lot of rhetoric, even saying this is a corrupt country, and the adjectives that the media and a lot of people use to describe Ukraine have not been positive. And that's everything that, what I hear in America is so much the opposite of what I've seen on the ground in this country. And especially since the war began, I've seen that Maidan mentality that I've heard about for so often, how every single person, no matter what your career is, the one job is victory, and everyone works together in sort of this magical way. But so how, I guess the first question, Professor, to you would be, is there a perception problem of Ukraine even now in the West? And the second thing, how do you really describe this idea of dignity and the Maidan mentality? Because I think in America, maybe we forgot what 76 is because it was so long ago. So how do we really, in this moment, how do you remind the world of what that mentality is? And for you and for Slava.
Thank you for this question. With dignity, terms exist not in the vacuum. They exist in a particular context which provides them with particular meaning. And the same is true with dignity, because the term revolution of dignity replaced the term Euro revolution at the time of Maidan of 2013. And the Euro revolution for orientation toward Europe, signing association agreement with Europe, turned into the revolution of dignity when the Kievans went to the streets to protest the beating up of the students by the police. So the dignity was about the dignity of the citizen vis-a-vis the authoritarian regime, or the regime that was trying to emulate Russia and become authoritarian, and was believed that they were free to beat up their citizens. So that was a very specific understanding of dignity in November and December of 2013. And it has been changing now in the context of this war. This is about dignity of individual, dignity of a nation, and dignity of a democracy that defends itself against autocratic regime. And I'm not a military expert, but what I understand about the successes of Ukrainian army today and Ukrainian people is that the individuals, the Ukrainian soldier or Ukrainian sergeant has much more freedom in deciding what to do and how to do than the Russian sergeant, where it's all top down. So that's again the dignity of individual, and then the dignity of society, and now the country and nation. So again, it is all depends on the context, but it is essential for Ukrainian self-understanding. In terms of the US, US is not Europe, geographically and otherwise, and in terms of the size. And in that sense, US always was much more focused on US itself. There is this maybe sad joke that war is God's name to teach Americans geography. So from that point of view, again, the U.S. relation to the events, especially in the country as far away as Ukraine, is different from the way how Poles look at that, or British look at that, or Germans look at that. But that being said, again, I have I didn't experience. I live in Canada now for a long period of time. I lived for 15 years, and now around the same time in the US. In the US, I never saw as much of indication of sympathy, interest in what is happening in Ukraine in terms of emails that I receive. I'll tell you a little anecdote that related to the book that was mentioned here, The Gates of Europe. Someone asked to send those copies to New York, and I asked, I'm in Europe now, I asked my wife to go to the post office and send those books. And when people in the lineup realized that she was Ukrainian, first of all, there were a lot of sympathy, there were questions. They put her ahead of line and gave a discount for sending those books that I never knew existed at all. So this is a small anecdote that for me tells a lot about how climate and how perception of Ukraine changed. In terms of a deeper understanding, broader understanding, well, that's where the American society or any other society relies really on the reporters on the ground and your good work. And again, from what I see, you're doing excellent work these days, guys. So thank you.
And if I could just take some of that and then ask Slava, because I think, I mean, for example, you hear, even like people on, like Tucker Carlson on Fox News has been saying Ukraine is not a democracy. And there's no real idea of what this country is. And I think, I would also say, like, as an Irish, like, I'm Irish and American. The Irish and English experience is so similar to what Russia and Ukraine has been. I mean, they're trying to suppress the language. And I think the more we can show some of these historical analogies, I think Americans would begin to understand this better. And Slava, you've been traveling the country more than anyone, especially right now in the wartime, which is extremely difficult. So maybe you can give us a sense of, what is this really Ukrainian soul and mentality on Monday in this very room, we had a conversation with a Greek Catholic Jesuit political philosopher. And I asked him the same question, and he said, the first answer he could say when he says, what does it mean to be Ukrainian? We want to be left alone. It was his gut reaction. And this has been Ukraine for 1,000 years. And we don't have any sense of that in America. So how, and I think I even look at Ireland where we lost, Ireland's been free for about 100 years, but the Irish have lost their language. They have some kind of freedom, but what freedom is it really in Ireland? Ukrainians have a deep sense. I mean, whether I experience the traditions of Christmas here, the language, the politeness of the language, there's such a rich culture here that the world has zero idea of. So maybe Slava, you could explain, because you've been speaking with Ukrainians in this moment of crisis from here to Kharkiv. What is Ukrainian dignity and freedom for each person here?
I'll start from joke that, these days Ukrainian language is not polite. The most popular word in Ukraine is actually a Russian curse word. Yeah, but we only apply it to the enemies. Frankly, we've already discussed a lot about definitions and everything. But I like this idea for just leave us alone. Ukrainians had what problem we had, because probably of geographical positions in the former times. And once again, I'm not a historian, but I like history and I know a little bit about that. So we were not in the position, we didn't have mountains from the east, Our country, we had mountains from the west. So it was easy to conquer us from the east, and then everything stopped in the west. And it was very difficult to oppose a big, autocratic, I would say, Mongolian-style Russian, state tradition, because Ukrainians were just farmers and they wanted to do, to make bread and everything. And then all these, brutal people without any sense of your home came and always conquered you and forced you to do this or that or that. And when other European nations were trying to establish their political identities, we were either fighting or just busy to at least to defend our, let's say, cultural identity, language, traditions, and everything. So after the World War I and World War II happened, states started to treat other states much more seriously. Even after 1648 from Westphalian, treaties, but even in the 19th century, 20th century. And Ukraine got first chance to become really independent in 1918. But we didn't use this chance, and big Western powers, France and Germany and the UK, they somehow leaned toward having good relationship with Poland and with then with new Soviet Union, newly created. And once again, Ukraine didn't have its chance. So in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and we finally got de jure our independence, many people took it for granted. And only now, these days, we are paying this big price. Many other nations were paying during their independence wars or big struggles for the independence. We are paying it now, and believe me, in a couple of months and in a year, the world will have much better and much more clear understanding why Ukraine is not Russia, why we are fighting them, and everything like that. You mentioned some journalists, but believe me, I was giving an interview to Fox News as much as to CNN. So both of them called me, and both of them gave right for me to explain what I feel and what Ukraine is. So in my opinion, from what I see, it's more or less bipartisan agreement for that Ukraine is fighting for independence now in the US, and that Ukraine needs help. And the same way, from what I see from sociological polls, that the whole Europe more or less, but the majority of Europeans support Ukraine and understand what we are doing now and why we are fighting. So one thing is not clear, that I think for many other people, that what will be next. So, and this is not clear for anybody, because we still don't know what will be the impact of the Russian invasion and the Russian crimes and everything. If you see what they're doing in cities like Mariupol or Chernihiv now, so this is exactly what was going on during World War II. When they asked me on CNN, what does it feel to be on in Kharkiv on this Sunday, I say, and do people, and I remember the journalist, she asked me, do people still live here? And I say, I don't know, you haven't been there, but probably some of your friends or relatives have their grandfathers or grandmothers who were in London or Coventry in 1940 and 1941. They can explain you exactly what was it feel to live in these places. So the more you guys from all over the world put a light on what's going on in Ukraine, the more you do your reports, the more you give the truth and the clear picture, the better the world will understand. Months and months and months and weeks and months of reports will give much more understanding. I don't know, maybe a professor will correct me, but I think in this 1 month, the world knows more about Ukraine than they knew before the last 30 years. Only 1 month. And it's still more to come. I don't want Ukraine to be on the headline news just because some other city was destroyed. But even if this happens, and even this worst case scenario, all of us need to use this kind of unprecedented attention and the awareness the world has now to push our, let's say, to push our idea, to show the world that all we are fighting for is just freedom. And these are the freedom that you guys in the West created as a identity marker many years ago. So we are fighting for what you created. So this is our message.
I absolutely agree here with Slava, because we had yesterday here a conversation with the office of the president in Crimea about Crimea, and it was like a tough day yesterday for this conversation. And there was one journalist from Japan who said that now he feels, he was online, like Mr. Plokhy is now here, and he said that he feels now that just in the recent few days, Japanese media and journalists and people in power started learning about Ukraine. They started asking questions not only about bombing, shellings, but also about what Ukraine is. And I do agree that we have months to go, but maybe Professor Plokhy has to add here.
If I could just jump in and think about Hong Kong, microphone. The people of Hong Kong who suffered under, or they knew some kind of oppression was coming to them, and when they were protesting in the streets, when they still were allowed to do that, in 2018 and 2019, they waved 3 different flags: the Ukrainian flag, the American flag, let's say the American flag, the British flag, and the Ukrainian flag. And so the people who were oppressed or faced that type of threat, they knew all about Ukraine. And so maybe this is now the world's chance to understand it.
Professor, do you have to add anything here?
No, I think I certainly agree with what Slava was saying, and with regard of Tucker Carlson, yes, there is that segment certainly of the American politics, which is similar to the segments all over the world and in Europe. This is about populism. This is about authoritarian tendencies. And there is a sort of an international of the authoritarian leaders or authoritarian thinkers which have and feel much more sympathy with Putin than they feel with Ukraine or with democratically elected leaders who have this weakness for authoritarian rulers. This is a global phenomenon. U.S. this time around is not. There is no American exception on that level. They're part of this global trend. And this is really something very, very concerning. But it looks like that we're winning, and Ukraine is an important part, important reason for that really push back against populism and authoritarian regimes all over the world. So it is a European war. It is also a global battle.
And I want to ask about poetical reality. And what do you feel about your text now? And maybe do you feel that some of your texts are extremely prognostic? And
You mean lyrics? The song,
yeah. And how does it possible? How is this process of poetical realizing about Ukraine is happening?
So, look, frankly, I don't know. I don't want to position myself as a prophet. First of all, it's very unmodest and I don't like it. Second, it's not necessarily correct. Practically, look, most of my songs, which are now, people say they're very actual, they come from different backgrounds. Some of them are love songs, and they just have lines like which reminds of a battle, because sometimes battle between two lovers, it's also a battle, we know it, and that's why the allegory works later. Some of these songs were written about my feeling of what is to be Ukrainian, and probably I predicted, not intellectually, but somehow spiritually predicted that one day, sooner or later, we will be fighting. Because that's what I felt. I never felt, I always felt, I was raised as Ukrainian. If you're from Lviv, you know my background, my family. My father was a true patriot. And he always raised me that we are Ukrainians, even during the Soviet Union times. And we always knew that we would be independent one day. But then, 1991, I was still a teenager, at 16. I remember that there was a controversy, and I felt second thoughts, because from one point of view, we were independent, and we finally had our flag, our money, our anthem, our capital, everything, all attributes. But from the other point of view, I saw many people, for example, in the east of Ukraine, who just felt much closer to their peers on the other side of border, for example, in Russia, than to their peers in Lviv, And I always had this kind of, in my head, there was a sort of question: what should it take for all Ukrainians to become a truly one, politically cohesive nation? And little by little, it started happening. And irony is that our enemy, who never accepted just the very existence of our nation, helped with this. First, when they actually, in a clumsy way, they wanted to interfere during our Maidan in Orange Revolution. Second, much more seriously, when they once again very, let's say, in an awkward but very brutal way, interfered during the Revolution of Dignity, taking over Crimea and imposing the war in Donbass. And it helped Ukraine once again to bring this sort of identity. And 24th of February was, I think, they imposed the war to subdue Ukraine, but I think it was the last nail in the coffin of their idea to make Ukraine part of Russian world. I think that day their rockets actually destroyed their dream. And Ukraine finally became what I dreamed about Ukraine, a whole, a big, cohesive political nation. Because when you go to Kharkiv, when you go to Mykolaiv, and I've been there, when you go to Okhterka now, when you go to the north of Ukraine in the Zhytomyr region, not far from Belarus border, everywhere, in Odessa, which always was a sort of unique city, everywhere Ukrainians are ready to fight, and they say, we are Ukrainians, we will never allow Russian army to come here, and we will resist till the end of the war, and this end of the war will be our victory. That's what all people say. And it took us 30 years and a couple of revolutions, and this war, unfortunately, all this kind of, so many challenges and such a big and hard price we were to pay for finally getting what people like me were dreaming about. And maybe this is the most bitter irony that history gives us. That if you really want to be successful, you need to pay a price for that. And we are paying this price for that. And that's why we need to win this war. Just because we cannot give up and we cannot
Betray.
We cannot betray. We cannot betray the sacrifice that all these people who are now dead and they give up their lives for Ukraine. We cannot betray the memory of these people. We don't have any other choice. The more people are being killed by Russian army and by Russians, and the more our children, innocent children, women are being killed, the bigger effort and the bigger, let's say, desire, for example, of me and other people, is to win this war and to stop this tragedy. And we need to do it. I think we don't have any other choice anymore. So we are now on the way to be a successful nation, I'm sure.
Yes, and we can have maybe two more questions. Azura?
Okay, thanks a lot. Sorry to be late. There was a misunderstanding in my agenda. I'm sorry to jump in 2 days. So I would like to ask both of you a reflection on this stage of negotiations. First of all, from an historical perspective, what was on the table yesterday is what Ukrainians fight for the last 8 years, more or less. And again, we were speaking now about this unity that also for me is very clear to see everywhere now. Do you think that we will see the same unity of Ukrainians supporting negotiations?
Maybe Professor Plokhy?
Yeah, well, there is a famous anecdote about apparently one of the American representatives asking a Chinese communist leader what did he think about the French Revolution, and the conversation was taking place in the 70s, and the response was that it was too early to say. So that's my response to negotiations in a nutshell, because we really don't know what has been happening there. There are comments in terms of that what the Ukrainian position has been, which provided a little bit more detail on what President Zelensky was saying. And was saying basically from the beginning of the aggression, from the beginning of this stage of the war, that Ukraine is prepared to put on hold at least the aim of joining NATO in response to another security arrangement with its allies. So, and it looks like that was a variation on the same theme and on the same topic. And unless I miss something, we don't know what the Russian position on it is. What we know for sure that actually you can't trust anything that the President Putin is saying or what the Russian delegation will be saying. There is no real reason for any sort of trust. So let's see what is happening. The negotiations per se is a very positive sign. What we hear, the noise that we hear from the Russian side, to a degree that it can be interpreted, is that there is admission of the failure of the original plans and ideas. And the war will be decided, and the fate of the war and of Europe will be decided on the battlefield. In my opinion, negotiations will actually help to reach some form of an agreement, but the key elements will be put together by the resistance, by Ukrainian resistance and by its success. So that's on the negotiations, and on the what was another part of the question?
About the unity of Ukrainian people, that is now very clear to me. If you think that we will see the same unity supporting negotiations, or at least what is on now in negotiations.
Again, it's I hope that we will see that unity. One thing that the President Zelensky demonstrated in the last, not only in the last months, but I think it was his strength throughout his political career, which, in my opinion, comes from his experience as a person who was on the stage, that he feels the audience, and he really channels the senses, or formulates senses, but channels the sentiment that audience is. Before the war, he was the first to say that there will be no war, and in that sense, again, was in sync with the Ukrainian society. And he has been in sync with the Ukrainian society once the war started in terms of the resistance. 90% of Ukrainians believed that Ukraine will win. So I really put my hope into this track record of Zelensky and his presidency, that he will be reflective of the sentiment in the society.
Do you want me to follow? First of all, I agree with most things that Professor said, so just to follow on that. First, very simple. Putin, when Putin or Russia claims something, just think the opposite. I mean, think that they mean the opposite. So if they want to withdraw troops, say they were withdrawing troops from the Kiev region, it means that either they will not, or they will withdraw just to come back with double force. If they say they will never use military way to conquer, to come to NATO states, means that maybe we win and we'll go after NATO states, because he was saying the same about Ukraine. Remember how many times they said they will never use military way to negotiate with Ukrainians? There was many times. Where are we now? Yesterday they say we will never fight the war against NATO. Just believe me, if they have power, if they are in potency, they will do it immediately, no hesitating. The same with the negotiations. When they say they are ready to give up some of their demands, it means that they are not ready, but they are buying time. And I completely agree with one thing that actually the president very nicely put, and it's his words, that the best diplomacy now is being done by Ukrainian troops in the trenches. And this is how the situation is going on now. The stronger Ukrainian resistance and the Ukrainian military efforts will be, the military successes will be, the better for not only for Ukraine, but for the whole democratic world, the impact of these negotiations will be. So I also agree it's too early to make any conclusions. One of the things I want to be focused in, that this
a new club of the countries that were proposed by Ukrainians just to be guarantees of Ukrainian independence and future. It's actually a redesigning of a NATO structure, but probably with a little different, with the help of some countries that probably are more willing to step in or something. We still don't have the reaction of these countries. So the major idea for all Ukrainians is, and I think the president and the team means this as well, is, look, we don't want to be part of any hostile bloc. We don't want to be any part of any belligerent bloc. We actually, the only desire for us to be a part of some bloc is that we know that maybe the aggressor, whoever could it be, will think not twice but 3 times before invading us. And this is the only very simple reason. So it doesn't matter who will be guarantees of your independence, and reciprocally maybe you will also guarantee somebody's independence. It's just we need to have a power enough combined so not a single aggressor in the world can challenge this power. Is it a NATO or is it another club of some military club of strong nations? It doesn't matter. The NATO is a very useful working mechanism if it's working. If there will be another mechanism which also will be safe and will be legitimately, kind of working legitimately, not like a Budapest memorandum, not just a piece of paper, but a document which will have an analog of something of Article 5 in the NATO treaty. Maybe that will be also the solution. But once again, I agree it's too early to make any conclusions. One thing that is clear, the Ukrainians are not ready to give up their land. And this is absolutely clear, and I think the president understands it. And I know personally 3 or 4, I know personally 4 of the negotiators from the Ukrainian side, but 2 of them I know well. One of them is a member of my former party, which I created. I actually invited him to join the parliament. He's now one of the negotiators, Rustem Umerov, yes. So these are smart people. These are people who know how to talk. These are not naive people. These are people with strong they can resist. But to help them, we need 40 million of people, including troops and including all citizens, to fight like hell now while they negotiate. And I agree that it will be very difficult for any negotiator to do something that is not supported by the majority of Ukrainians. And the majority of Ukrainians absolutely wants all our territories back, and they want us to be peaceful nation and to be safe. These are parameters in which we need to work later. And political names of treaties, blocs, or neutralities is a very important question. But this is a form. But essence is we want to be safe, independent, and in our borders, which are internationally recognized.
Okay. Any other questions?
Українською, перепрошую за мою англійську.
Давай.
Скажіть, Славко, будь ласка, як ви гадаєте, яка роль росіян в тому, що відбувається, і чи взагалі варто про це говорити, і чи потрібно вибудовувати окрему комунікацію для того, аби впливати на них, посилювати їхню участь, або можливо, це взагалі не вартує брати до уваги?
So what is the role of Russian people in all this situation, and should we somehow communicate with them and influence on that?
This is a very difficult question, because in my personal experience, I've been to Russia many times. I've seen probably more Russian cities than most Russians. Yes, that is for sure. From the Far East to Kaliningrad, everywhere, many times during 15 years. I've been there. I somehow feel them in the case that I understand their perception. Russians as a nation always were very, let's say, arrogant towards Ukraine, always. Even when they were peaceful, even when they were okay, and even if they like your music, which is true that millions of Russians sang our songs and everything. But they had it in their blood, this arrogance towards Ukraine, that this is something, in their opinion, was a pseudo-state, you know? And this is the biggest problem with them. It's not the problem only of Putin or the war per se. Remember, even their big, prominent opposition leader, Navalny, said once that Crimea is not a sandwich, you know, and so we cannot give it here back and forth. And this is the biggest problem. If there was a problem that the big part of society, let's say, fully respects Ukraine as a nation, then it would be much easier, because then it would be easier to ask them for help, and some of them there would be resilience even under this regime. Because, for example, remember how many thousands of Russians went on the streets and flooded in the streets during these corruption cases against Putin. So there was a case for them, a big case. So they went, there were millions of them. The protests didn't come to anything serious, but it was powerful. They don't come on the streets when the Ukrainian war and the Russians go for the war, because partly they feel maybe it's right, you know, because this is imperialistic way of thinking. So from one point of view, I think it may be not productive to talk to them. But from the other point of view, the more we show what wrong is being done in Ukraine, how big atrocities are being done by the army and by those who command. And there are many people who have relatives and everything. And maybe just in the case of stopping the war, not thinking of Ukraine positively, but stopping the war, that may give some efforts. But the problem is that all independent media are done in Russia. So this is completely Orwellian state or Soviet state during the before Gorbachev era. So nobody can talk anything, can speak. Maybe YouTube or some social networks are still there, but they block very quickly any independent things, like President Zelensky interview to Russians that was blocked and everything. So I don't know. I still keep trying. Look, I still keep trying, and I have plans. We're still thinking about the effective way to address Russians, because we still remember this song of Sting, I hope the Russian loves the children too, you know? And if they love their children, they should and they must stop killing our children.
Thank you.
I think there was probably the last question, and I think just the night before the invasion, we printed this paper where we say 5 reasons why Ukrainians will win. And I hope that today we heard more reasons why Ukrainians will win. And I think we tried to explain Ukraine more, and the world will understand us better and be more proactive in all this situation and more united. And thank you also for this unity and for participation. And thank you speakers, thank you journalists, and those who will follow up on that.
May end up with, I just saw these 5 reasons, and I love the last one. We will win because we can't lose. And this is the most important. I love it.
Thank you.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!